Okay, this is the fourth lecture for lifespan development in social work. And our topic, as you can see, is health and wellness. We're going to be looking at things that both contribute and undermine health and wellness. So let's start off with stress and coping. Stress is the response to events that threaten or challenge an individual. Our lives are filled with events and circumstances known as stressors that cause threats to our well-being. Stressors can be both pleasant events and unpleasant events. Long-term continuous exposure to stressors may result in a reduction of the body's ability to deal with stress. Stress is something that we experience throughout our entire life cycle, from infancy until death. Lawrence and Folkman are sociologists that have studied stress. And they believe, or they have hypothesized, that people move through a series of stages that determines whether an event that they are faced with is experienced as stressful. They have two parts to this: primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. Primary appraisal is the assessment of an event to determine whether its implications are positive, negative, or neutral. Secondary appraisal is the assessment of whether one's coping abilities and resources are adequate to overcome any harm, threat, or challenge posed by the potential stressor. Events and circumstances that produce negative emotions are more likely to be appraised as stressful and therefore produce stress. Situations that are uncomfortable or unpredictable are also more likely to be appraised as stressful and therefore cause stress. Likewise, events or circumstances that are considered ambiguous or are confusing also produce stress. So people who must, and also I should say, people who must accomplish many tasks simultaneously are also more likely to experience stress. So even if you are able to multitask, research shows that when people are faced with doing multiple tasks at the same time, they tend to experience that they tend to appraise that as a stressful experience and therefore experience more stress. Now, there are consequences of stress. Researchers in the new field of psychoneuroimmunology, or PNI, this is the study of the relationships among the brain, the immune system, and psychological experiences. And they have found that stress produces several outcomes for our bodies. Hormones, for example, from the adrenal glands cause a rise in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and sweating. People become more susceptible to disease as their ability to fight off germs declines. That is because of the experience of stress and the hormonal responses that can have an influence on the on blood pressure, heart rate, etc. This causes fatigue, and fatigue then causes problems for the immune system, or weakens the immune system, or slows it down, if you will, and then the person is more susceptible to fighting off infections. Academic stress, which you should probably be familiar with, is another area of study. Research has shown that academic competition to perform at the top and achieve high grades produces a great deal of ongoing stress. More homework, less time to play, or otherwise develop socially and emotionally also tends to produce ongoing stress. So I suppose you can make a case for less homework. Also, adolescents who go to bed later and get up earlier tend to have, of course, less sleep, experience sleep deprivation, and then experience more stress. Theorists conclude that some adolescent that the consequences for adolescents can also lead to eating disorders. And we will actually, explore a little bit more about eating disorders a little bit later on. But what they're saying is that the research shows that these multiple sources of stress for adolescents can cause various different consequences such as sleep deprivation, and for some individuals, eating disorders. Stress also can continue to impact adult life as well, or adult health. Parents who worry over their children often have longer periods and sometimes intense periods of stress. In later adulthood, with declining strength, energy, loss of memory, intellectual or sexual desire, which declines, all of these decline, and this can cause a sense of stress, vulnerability, etc. Stress can also have negative consequences for relationships. And this is true, although I was talking about adults right now, this is actually true across the entire life cycle. Stress may also lead to psychosomatic disorders. And a psychosomatic disorder, if you're unfamiliar with that, is a medical problem that is caused by the interaction of psychological, emotional, and physical difficulties, wherein the primary or the strongest piece of etiology for the medical problem is due to the emotional state of the individual versus to some other physiological process. Coping with stress. Coping with stress is really about reducing or tolerating the threats in our lives, or those experiences that create a sense of threat in our lives, and that threat then leads to stress. So it's reducing or tolerating these threats that lead to stress. Some people are better at coping than others. There are just some people who tend to tolerate threats better or know how to reduce those threats a bit more easily or readily, perhaps it's a better term, than others. There are different ways that people try to cope with stressors. One is what they call problem-focused coping, and this is the use of managing stress through problem solving by attempting to manage a stressful problem or situation by directly changing the situation to make it less stressful. So it's a very proactive approach to stress reduction. There's emotion-focused coping, which involves the conscious regulation of emotions. So people try to regulate how they are feeling very proactively. Coping is also aided by the presence of social support. This is a critical piece of stress reduction as well as coping with stress. And what is meant by social support is basically the assistance and comfort that a person experiences by others or from others. Defense coping is yet another approach. This involves unconscious strategies that distort or deny the true nature of the situation. Two classic examples of this is emotional insulation. A more classic term would be called denial, where a person denies that the event is stressful or bothers them in some way. They literally just deny that it's having any impact on them. Another approach that is defense coping would be the use of substances to escape from the emotional impact of stressful events. They feel the stress, they feel the unpleasant emotions, and they use substances to dampen that or reduce it or even change the mood so that it is more euphoric. Another area of research about stress and coping is regarding hardiness and resiliency. And unfortunately, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this, but there's a whole body of literature about hardiness and resiliency. Much of this has focused on children who have grown up in, I should say on adults, who as children grew up in very long-term, ongoing, stressful environments and yet turned out okay. And what was it about these individuals that helped them to turn out okay? And this is where the idea of hardiness or resiliency comes from. Hardiness is a personality characteristic associated with a lower rate of stress-related illness. Okay? And resiliency refers to the ability to be easygoing, good-natured, have good social and communication skills, all of which helps the individual to adapt to the different types of coping, the different types of stressful events that they are faced with. For example, if somebody is faced with ongoing family problems and stress, somebody whose personality is more easygoing, more good-natured, has very good social skills and communication skills, can use those abilities as a way of managing to get around and through those kinds of ongoing, let's say, family experiences. Let me give you an example of some research where I was just telling you about resiliency in childhood. And this is about older children. And I'm referring to older children between the, what I mean by older children are kids who are between the ages of 7 and 11. We know that children develop successfully in a family life that is stable and consistent. Family life is pivotal to coping. But research also shows that children develop successfully in many kinds of family structures. The key is whether it is stable and supportive. Okay, that is the key issue. These are some interesting facts about American children. Only around 35% of all children born in the 1990s resided in a traditional family. And the traditional nuclear, I should say the traditional nuclear family. That is, one dad and one mom who are the biological parents of the child. So think about it. During the 1990s, only a third of the children in the United States were raised in homes in the traditional family, nuclear family form. It is the nature of the family's interactions between the adults that predicts problems in children. That's one of the most predictive elements. It's one of those elements of family life that helps to predict the possibility or probability of problems for kids in that family. This also includes divorce. The more acrimonious the divorce, the more problems for the children. But there is good news about divorce, believe it or not. Very little supports that children from divorce will do substantially worse automatically. Typically, children of divorce do poorer than those in intact families for about the first year or two of the divorce. Then, guess what? They compensate and show resiliency. Even an intact family, that is, the parents are not divorced, can be toxic for children if the relationship between the adults in the home is acrimonious over long periods of time. So remember that. What helps older children to cope according to the literature? There are different sources of resources for children. One is the individual child themselves. We've already talked about this before. Are they easygoing by nature? Do they have good social and communication skills? Do they have good intellectual functioning? Do they have a sense of self-efficacy or self-esteem, at least in one area of their lives? They don't have to have a high sense of self-esteem across all of their lives, but they have one area that they feel strongly about or feel good about themselves. They show talent. They are appealing. They are nice to get along with. Think about this, that children who are affable, easygoing, pleasant to be around with, even if they come from homes or environments that are very disruptive, the adults in their lives will tend to also behave that way towards them. Lastly, a religious faith that also tends to be a positive resource for the individual child. Family is also an area, of course. The child's family is a source of a resource for the child. Are there close relationships with at least one caring adult in the family? Is there this authoritative parenting style versus authoritarian versus laissez-faire? And we'll get into parenting styles later in the semester. There are socioeconomic advantages. Children from working class, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthier homes do tend to have more resources available to them so that they can cope better. The research just consistently bears that out. And are there connections to the extended family and or the broader community? That is, the family is not isolated from other families or other branches of the family. The more support the family has, guess what? Is more support for the child. And then there are larger contextual factors, community and societal factors, bonds with pro-social adults outside of the family, you know, that coach, that minister, that big brother, the teacher, etc. Are these kind of pro-social bonds that the child has outside of the family? Is there involvement with pro-social organizations, such as community organizations, playgrounds? All of this is very important for kids. Is there effective schooling? Is there stability in the neighborhood? Is there low turnaround as far as who's there, who's living there, and who's not? Or is there a heavy turnover of who lives in the neighborhood? Are there supportive friendships? Other children are supportive of the child. Stable economy. When the economy is stable, communities tend to be more stable, which means families tend to be more stable, which means that children have more resources to cope when they are faced with stressful events. And then there is also lack of social unrest or warfare. This is particularly true for immigrant children, by the way, because those of us who have been born here in the United States, we have not experienced or rarely experienced warfare on our shores. We often forget that people can experience, including children, ongoing environments of warfare. And many immigrant groups, or at least some immigrant groups that have come to the United States, have come here to flee very unstable, hostile, violent war environments. Also, there's also been research about gang warfare in neighborhoods and how this also can be highly stressful for a community, for the families in it, and for children. So that's an example of one period. Look at the multiple, we talk about systems, multiple systems interacting with each other. We have the individual child, some genetics there, personality traits, all the way up to societal elements that can influence the kind of resources that are available, or lack of resources, that are available to just a child, one child, between the ages of 7 and 11, who is coping with a stressful environment. So let's move into illness and well-being. We started with coping and stress, which has a, we've already made that connection, that that can influence, that is stress, ongoing stress can influence well-being. Well-being is defined as the absence of risk factors, okay? That's a very important thing. The fewer the risk factors, the more likely the individual will experience both physiological and emotional well-being. One of the major issues for well-being across the entire life cycle is weight. Believe it or not, it is weight. Historically, when you look at this balance that I have here, most of the attention historically has been towards malnutrition, okay? Malnutrition is the condition of having an improper amount and balance of nutrients, which produces several results for anyone, particularly for children. It slows growth and stunts growth. It causes the individual to be susceptible to disease. It lowers IQ scores for children, so it interferes with brain development. Risks are greater in underdeveloped countries and in areas with high poverty rates. Okay? So historically, much of the population, much of the human species, believe it or not, was often faced with the possibility of malnutrition. This is different from the idea of undernutrition, which results when there is some specific deficiency in the diet. Malnutrition can cause all sorts of problems, and if you want to look into this further, the book goes into, and some of our readings go into, some of the specific results of malnutrition. With improving life conditions for the average individual, we have seen now that not only is malnutrition an issue, but now obesity, that is the situation where people weigh too much, or the weight for the individual is such that it can cause ongoing, long-term, and sometimes life-threatening health problems. Let's look at obesity in childhood in particular. There appears to be no correlation between childhood obesity, which is defined as weight greater than 20% above the average for a given height, and then later weight at age 16, which is very interesting. A lot of people assume that those are closely linked, but the research so far does not show that. Research, although inconclusive, suggests an excess of fat cells which remain in the body throughout life early on may predispose an individual to an overweight person as an adult. So there is this kind of interesting experience from the research that children can be obese, then obese, then in adolescence lose weight, and then be at higher risk for gaining back at least some of that weight once they reach adulthood. In adolescence, obesity is the most common nutritional concern in adolescence, and it is now becoming that way in adulthood. Now in the United States, 1 in 5 adolescents is overweight, and 1 in 20 is obese. In fact, I think those numbers have changed, and that is actually somewhat higher. The proportion of obese females increases through adolescence. Adolescent obesity is caused by many factors, similar to obesity in childhood. So I didn't tease those out. I just wanted to cover it once, and I decided to do that in adolescence. But the consequences are somewhat different. For adolescents, remember body image is very important. children start to become more aware of their bodies and how other people judge or view their bodies by older childhood, and that only increases in adolescence. So there can be psychological effects of a distorted body image. There can also be physical health consequences as well. In adulthood, adult obesity is on the rise. 12% of people between the ages of 18 and 29 years of age are obese. Remember that this is the peak of health for an individual is in young adulthood. So to see 12% of the population being obese, that's a considerable amount for that population. We do expect weight gain into middle adulthood and somewhat into early older adulthood. So we do expect some of that. That's normative. But young adulthood, we don't expect that. Or at least traditionally, historically, we haven't expected that. But we're seeing that change. Also later in adulthood, the numbers of those who are obese, that is also rising as well. There are many possible risk factors. Remember when we talk about risk factors that these are not guaranteed circumstances. It just means that the individual has a greater likelihood of having these problems. There are people who are obese who never have any of these problems or only a few of these problems, and there are people who are the weight they're supposed to be and have a number of these problems. So remember, there's a lot of individual variation around these, around what I'm going to mention now. Obesity can contribute in several ways, and I'll get into that over the next few minutes. Obesity may be contributing to a decline in the lifespan in the United States of America. There are some researchers who are now beginning to wonder if this may in fact reduce, we may start seeing a reversal in the lifespan of individuals. This is because people who are obese are susceptible to heart disease as well as to diabetes. And both of these conditions can be life-threatening, particularly as individuals get older. There's some research to suggest that there may be some link to cancer, but I think that that's a bit less definitive at this point. Certainly, though, obesity puts people at higher risk for cardiovascular problems, high blood pressure, which is included in that, as well as diabetes. All of these can be life-threatening, particularly as we age. There are several factors that influence why people perhaps are more susceptible to gaining weight and becoming obese than others. One is, you're ready, I know you know this, genetics. And there may be a predisposition for some people to keep weight off and other people to gain weight more easily. There may be social characteristics such as how readily available is food in the home environment or in the school environment or in the work environment. This can influence whether people eat or not. Also, the kind of things that we eat also influences weight gain and obesity. So, for example, you know, we are told over and over again, low-fat diet, grains, encouragement to eat more fish and lean meats, and guess what? Fruits and vegetables. So when we see these kinds of factors coming together, genetics, the social characteristics of the environment that an individual is exposed to or in regularly, as well as the diet that many of us engage in, whether we have weight on us or not. All of these can influence an individual's risk to obesity. Food preferences is also a big piece. This tends to be very individualized. We see food preferences beginning in infancy. And I bet you if you talk to any mother or any caretaker who has dealt with an infant or lots of infants can attest to the fact that food preferences begin very early in life. Interestingly enough, children, the research shows, prefer foods preferred by their mothers. Now, I know that we're used to thinking that children resist eating the foods that their parents want them to eat, but in fact, children tend to follow their families as to what foods they prefer. Some of this might be genetic as well. In the critical early years of life, children develop food preferences, as I said, and eating habits favoring convenience foods high in sugar, fat, low in nutrients starts as early as young childhood. Providing fruits and vegetables, and I'm going to add another thing, and modeling eating fruits and vegetables lowers the rates of obesity in children, and guess what? Also in adults later in life. In fact, there is some research to suggest that the best way for a child to lose weight is that the entire family changes their lifestyle. The parents start to become more physically active. They start changing their food. It's not just the child who changes the diet, but the whole family changes the diet along with the child. Even if the other family members don't have any concerns or issues with weight, everyone changes their diet, everyone increases their activity level. For example, the family joins the local YMCA and everyone goes to the gym or to the pool together with the child who needs to increase their activity level. Social influences, I think we've already talked about this before, particularly with what's available in school environments. There's been a lot of debate about diet, what foods are available, advertising, having these readily available sugary and sweet soft drinks, foods, snacks, etc., readily available there. If it's available, guess what? Kids will eat it. If it's not available, guess what? They don't eat it. It's just the way. It's just a fact of life. Okay, let's move on to eating disorders. And the ones that I'm going to be looking at, we were talking about obesity, although obesity is not necessarily thought of as an eating disorder per se. But anorexia nervosa and bulimia are considered eating disorders. The prevalence of these eating disorders has increased over the last 20 years. I would say it's been increasing over the last 40 years. Because even when I was a teenager, yes, we'll go back to my life again, people were talking about the increase of these eating disorders, especially anorexia nervosa. Some adolescents and adults have habits that have serious, eating habits, I should say, that have serious consequences for their health. And again, this is what you call anorexia nervosa, which is a severe eating disorder in which individuals restrict the amount of calories that they take in while denying that their behavior and appearance, which may even become skeletal, are out of the ordinary. And anorexia nervosa often comes up, especially with different pop singers, different childhood stars, especially with girls and young women. And so there's been a lot of people being concerned about anorexia nervosa for a while. This disorder primarily affects white women between the ages of 12 and 14. 15 to 20% of those who have anorexia eventually die from it. So it is a life-threatening disorder. Also, women who are often intelligent, successful, attractive, and are from affluent homes are more likely to be anorexic than those who are not. And believe it or not, about 10% of people who have anorexia are male. Bulimia is an eating disorder characterized by binges of large quantities of food, which are then followed by acts of purging, particularly through the use of vomiting and or the use of laxatives. What can happen from this kind of experience is that a chemical imbalance can result from the constant vomiting or diarrhea. This can cause serious side effects, including in its more serious situations, heart failure. Eating disorders are the product of both biological and environmental causes, just like everything else that we've been talking about. So treatment often involves multiple approaches. Okay. Other threats to wellness and health. Risks depend on the age period a person is in. There are different risk factors, that is, for children than for younger adults than for older adults. Most children in the United States have reasonably healthy bodies. Despite all of what I just talked about with anorexia nervosa and obesity, the vast majority of children in the United States have reasonably healthy bodies. However, increasing numbers are being treated for behavioral problems. For example, many children receive nowadays medication for emotional problems, far more than has ever been seen in the history of the United States. There's been some concern that parents and teachers may be too quick to fix these behavioral problems that are perhaps normal difficulties in childhood and adolescence. And there's some controversy about this. Especially those of you who will be working with children or who are working with children, you may see some of this. Accidents pose the greatest risk for children, and we talked about that previously, particularly for males. Before the age of 10, children are twice as likely to die of an injury than from an illness. Now that is substantially different than 100 years ago, by the way, and we talked about that earlier in the semester. High levels of activity and especially risk-taking can lead to higher rates of accidents. There are different ways that we can safeguard environments for children to decrease injury. There's the child-proofing of homes, as we know about. There's helmets for outdoor activities. If somebody ever told me when I was 12 years old that I'd have to wear a helmet while riding a bicycle, I would have laughed. But nowadays, that's normal as a way of decreasing childhood injuries. Vehicle safety restraints, reducing exposure to lead. One of the most baffling threats to wellness, especially in young childhood, is sudden infant death syndrome, which is a disorder which kills infants in their sleep, and these infants are seemingly healthy, are without any medical problem, and yet they still die in their sleep. This affects 1 in 1,000 infants in the United States annually. And when I look at that number, that's a lot higher than I thought it was, to be honest with you. No cause has been found as to why this occurs. It is the leading cause of death in children under the age of 1 year. Boys, African American babies, low birth weight babies, babies whose mothers smoked during pregnancies, babies with certain brain defects, and children who have been abused are at higher risk for SIDS. SIDS deaths occur in children of every race, every socioeconomic group, as well as children with no apparent health problems, as I said before. Okay. Let's move to adolescence again. We're going back to adolescence. Now, many of the things that I talked about before can be risk factors for adolescents, such as activity levels, risk-taking behaviors, let's see what else, not using vehicle safety restraints, et cetera, et cetera. But there are very specific risks that are associated with adolescence, and I wanted to deal with two of them. One of them is substance abuse, and the other is sexually transmitted diseases. Substance abuse, in the 1990s, we saw drug use rise after a decline in the 1980s. There was a rise in drug use during the 1960s and 70s. There was a decline during the 1980s, and we once again saw a rise in the 1990s. I honestly do not know what the numbers are for the 2000 aughts, between 2000 and 2010. More than 20% of 8th graders and close to 50% of high school seniors said that they have smoked marijuana at least once in the previous year. Illegal drugs, not only is drug use increasing, but illegal drug use is part of that increase in drug use. More than half of high school seniors have used an illegal drug at least once in their lives. And there are different theories. I mean, people have been theorizing why this occurs in adolescence since the late 1960s and 1970s until today. There's probably the perceived pleasurable experience that people have when using the substance. There's increased stress, and it's an escape from stress, like we talked about earlier for adults. Well, kids do this as well. Peer pressure, risk-taking behavior tends to increase amongst adolescents, just in general. A number of their role models may use drugs, the thrill of doing something illegal. These are the different kinds of theories as to why youth might engage in illegal drug use. Addictive drugs are anything that produces a biological and/or psychological dependence in users, leading to an increasingly powerful craving for the drugs. A major danger of drugs as escapism is that adolescents never learn to confront their original problems and learn problem-solving skills that will be critical for them in adulthood. Casual users amongst adolescents can escalate to more dangerous forms of substance abuse at a much higher rate than adults who casually use. Okay, that is, if somebody starts using a drug, including alcohol, by the way, which I'll get to in just a moment, if they start using that drug in adolescence, they are more likely to develop an addiction, some biological and or psychological addiction to it, if they use just as casual users than adults. And the thinking is that because the body is still developing and growing, that adolescent is vulnerable and therefore at higher risk for addiction. And of course, addiction includes the use of alcohol. More than 75% of college students, now we're starting to move out of adolescence into young adulthood, have consumed at least one alcohol drink during the previous 30 days. More than 40% of college students say that they've had 5 or more drinks within the past 2 weeks. 76% of high school seniors drink alcohol regularly. Now, regularly can mean as little as at parties, every time they go to a party, they have a beer, to every day. 75, I already said that. Binge drinking, which is drinking 5 or more drinks for men or 4 or more for women in one sitting, is a particularly troubling pattern in college students. In fact, 50% of males and 39% of females report binge drinking in the previous 2 weeks. Why do adolescents and college students drink so much? Again, here is some theories as to why this happened. Because it's an adult thing to do. Makes people feel like they're acting more like adults. There may be the maintenance of a macho image for males in particular, obviously. It's releasing inhibitions of tension. We've already talked about that. And then there is what they call a false consensus effect, an assumption that everyone else is doing it, so why shouldn't I? Okay, let's see. The last thing I want to mention about alcohol is the idea of alcoholism and drug addiction in general. Persons with alcohol problems who have learned to depend on the alcohol and are unable to stop their drinking are considered alcoholics. Teens may be genetically prone to become alcoholics as well as adults. Remember that although teens are more susceptible to addiction, adults can still fall into addiction as well. So there is some evidence to show that there can be a predisposition, a genetic predisposition or physiological predisposition for some individuals to be more susceptible or vulnerable to addiction, to, in this case, alcohol. Smoking is also another important factor to talk about. Again, many of the same reasons that that adolescents use to justify or explain why they use drugs or alcohol are the same kinds of reasonings they use for tobacco. Although the amount of smoking in general has decreased over the last 50 years in the United States, in fact, it's been one of the most successful public health programs in the United States, nonetheless, there are still significant numbers of adolescents who smoke, although again, this proportion has decreased. Smoking, interestingly enough, in the more recent years, is more prevalent among girls than amongst boys. I find that very interesting because it was reversed when I was younger. See, it all comes back to me again. Whites tend to smoke more often than African Americans. People who smoke as few as 10 cigarettes early in their lives, that is, in adolescence, stand an 80% chance of becoming habitual smokers as adults. The last thing I want to mention for adolescents, of course, you see here is the sexually transmitted diseases. When I was a kid, we talked about such things as syphilis and gonorrhea. Chlamydia came in, and people said, oh, chlamydia. Then genital herpes came along in the late 1970s. And then, of course, by the late 70s into the 1980s, we saw the first appearance of AIDS. The acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. All of these are sexually transmitted, or transmitted through intimate bodily contact. And oftentimes, teenagers who begin to experiment with their sexuality, begin to have sexual relations with others or intimate contact with others, often do not have proper information about sexually transmitted diseases and do not take the proper precautions to decrease or avoid the transmission of these illnesses. Since AIDS, for example, is spread primarily through sexual contact, it is classified as a sexually transmitted infection. It has been difficult to motivate adolescents to use safe sex measures and change their sexual behaviors, and because of that, they are now one of the groups that is at highest risk for contracting the disease. Presently, African Americans and Hispanics or Latinos account for nearly 40% of AIDS cases. 16 million people have died of AIDS, and the number of people living with the disease is now over 34 million worldwide. 2.5 million teenagers have contracted any kind of sexually transmitted disease, not just AIDS. The human papillomavirus, or HPV, is the most common STI, often showing no symptoms and long suspected of leading to cervical cancer. A vaccine recommended by the CDC that protects against some kinds of HPV is now available. Chlamydia is the most common sexually transmitted disease, and it's caused by a parasite. Genital herpes is also common sexually transmitted disease, which is a virus, not unlike a cold sore, that sometimes appears around the mouth or also around the genitals. And then, of course, gonorrhea and syphilis used to be deadly 50 years ago, but can now be treated successfully with antibiotics. So the important thing about avoiding sexually transmitted disease for adolescents is abstinence. I know that that's a controversial idea for some people, because some people only want to talk about abstinence, and then some people say it's unrealistic to expect abstinence. But it is a safe sex practice, believe it or not. Practicing safe sex, such as use of condoms, avoid exchanging bodily fluids, staying sober, not being intoxicated, considering fewer partners, monogamous relationships where you know the individual, you practice safe sex together, etc. These are ways to lower the risks or chances of contracting a sexually transmitted disease, not just for AIDS, although including AIDS. So this is a major issue for adolescents. It does continue to be an issue, I might add, for young adults, but generally as people get into their mid to late 20s, that risk-taking behavior genuinely diminishes. Okay, variations and disparities in health. I wanted to introduce these ideas because although we've talked about risk factors for children and adolescents, these are ways of looking at health disparities in the general population, including adults. We have mortality, morbidity, disability, and quality of life or vitality. Mortality deals with the rate of death per 1,000 individuals. Okay? Morbidity is the rate of a disease or the incidence of a disease. That is, whether it's acute or chronic. Disability refers to the limitation in typical functioning secondary to some sort of physical condition, which can be temporary, it can be partial, or it can be chronic. And then quality of life, or some people use the term vitality, is a subjective measure of how vital, energetic, fulfilled an individual feels about their life, regardless of where their health status might be at. There are several factors that increase wellness and life longevity. Across all cultures, the following tends to increase longevity, diminish risk of chronic illnesses, or if they have chronic illnesses, tends to diminish the disabling symptoms or impact of the illness. That is, higher education levels, higher levels of financial security, and urban dwelling. These are all related with improved outcomes for wellness. There are also differences in health disparities based on race and ethnicity, national residence, part of the country or region that a person lives, the sex of the individual, socioeconomic status, which of course we've already talked about previous, and religious affiliation. So here are some averages as examples of differences in health status. Between the ages of 45 and 55, rates of death and disability follow these basic patterns. African Americans die or are disabled at twice the rate of Caucasians. Caucasians die or are disabled at twice the rate of Asian Americans. Latino Americans have 20% less rate of death disability than that of the national rate. Native Americans have 20% greater rate of death disability than the national rate. And then there are even differences within these groups. So for example, if we look at Asian Americans, Japanese Americans tend to live longer than Filipino Americans. Cuban Americans live longer than Puerto Rican Americans. Recent immigrants are healthier than people born here from the same ethnicity and age. Now think about that one. Recent immigrants are healthier than people born here from the same ethnicity and age. If you're not quite sure why, go back and re-listen to the earliest first half part of this lecture, and you'll know why. Sex differences. Middle-aged men die at twice the rate of all causes, 3 times the rate of heart disease, than women. Women, on the other hand, have higher rates of morbidity, that is, chronic illnesses. Why? Research shows that men are more likely to smoke. So in older generations, men have tended to be the ones who smoked more than women. Younger generations, such as adolescents, we tend to see either a parity, equal number of boys and girls smoking, or more girls smoking. So men are more likely to smoke. They tend to drink in excess. They tend to be overweight, and the weight tends to be around their chest, which tends to cause more trouble or problems, and pressure around for the cardiovascular system. They tend to repress emotional expression. They tend to ignore medical symptoms, and they tend to go to the doctor later than sooner. Men are thus more likely to die suddenly rather than experience a chronic illness. Likewise, medicine has traditionally been more focused on acute illnesses and averting immediate death rather than dealing with a chronic illness, which, by the way, tends to affect more women than men. Adulthood and health risks can include each of the following: osteoporosis, arthritis, coronary health disease, cancer, and dementia. Most of these conditions do not start to appear until later in life. Having said that, there are forms of these even in rare cases for children, but typically can start for some individuals earlier in life. Okay? But again, when we're looking at these kinds of problems, we're now getting into mid-adulthood and later adulthood. I'm not going to, let me see, I'm not going to go into each of these specific medical problems. But if you are interested, look to see, there's information in our reading. You can easily go online and find out more information about each of these if you are interested in learning more about each of these issues. Let's see. I'm looking through my notes, and one thing I want to really focus on is, let's see, threat of cancer, no. Alzheimer's disease. let's go on to the next one, and that is the 5 major habits: smoking, alcohol, nutrition, weight, exercise, activity level. These become increasingly important from young adulthood into older adulthood as to its impact on an individual's life. It is very important for teenagers as well. But young adulthood, again, is that peak period, and then middle adulthood and older adulthood, these issues become more critical. Smoking, research on its impact is most consistent and clear. Smoking increases rates of certain cancers, as well as certain diseases of the cardiovascular system, such as heart disease, pneumonia, stroke, emphysema. Alcohol intake, research shows that too much or none at all is undesirable. Why? Because certain wines used in small amounts can be beneficial. However, constant use and overuse can lead to life-threatening illnesses such as liver problems and alcoholism. And of course, people who have a history of alcoholism, the best approach is sobriety. Nutrition, the most important known fact from research is that less fat, particularly in the West, and more fiber is beneficial to avoiding certain complicating health problems. There's a reason why you see a lot of commercials for fiber pills on TV. Weight. Some want to make this the next major health problem. We've already talked about this. And that particularly obesity creates risk for various forms of cardiovascular illness, diabetes. I forgot to mention arthritis. Forgot about arthritis. That is also linked to it. And then some research tends to suggest some cancer, some forms of cancer. Exercise and activity level. Adequate levels of exercise and activity not only burns up calories, it improves heart and lung capacities. It assists with muscle toning, joint flexibility. Note, some middle-aged adults think more is better. That is, they may not have exercised for a while, and they say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to exercise, and then they exercise as if they are still 22 years old, and then wind up having all sorts of problems, including injuries. Moderation, balance, homeostasis. That is the approach to activity level and exercise for middle-aged adults. Okay, let's see. I think that's where I'm going to stop for now. There's lots more information in your readings, as well as you can look these up online and find out more information. Thank you for listening to this week's presentation, and I will talk to you again next week.